of the couple were young, right? So largely, very out of date estate plans. They used a local trust and estate attorney to put together plans, but they were really just a basic trust, and the attorney really had only experience with basic trusts. More recently, attempts to discuss planning have been put off due to changing tax laws that have seemed a little confusing for the husband and the wife, and a general misunderstanding of how to best dive in. Like, where do we start? The husband's modest upbringing has caused him to be somewhat anxious about this idea of wealth transfer into the next generation, to even to his adult kids. Assuming if there were a sale of any business, the founders would like to provide for the college education of their grandchildren and future descendants. And then lastly, Leaf Life Organics is a local, well-known brand, and they give generously to the community, and the family would like to continue the support for the local community and ensure that the children of the loyal employees have some provision for their education. Okay, so again, there hasn't been a lot of prior trust and estate work that's been done, and that generosity also extends to the children of their employees, because they've been with them for many, many years. So maybe we'll take down the case, and if we can just go open it back up first before we bring on the next screen. Let's just talk about what everybody is thinking about in light of what you've just heard. So just welcome any and all thoughts about what might be happening here, and what are some issues just for consideration. Simran, maybe I'll call on you first. Anything going on for you that's coming up?
Is it okay if I type it? There's people around and it's really loud. I don't want you guys to hear. Okay.
Yes.
Thank you.
Of course. Thank you, Simran. Yeah. Let's see, Joanne. Hello. It's nice to see you.
Hi, nice to see you too.
Yeah.
Well, if they don't address the issues, if something happens and the family doesn't agree, they could, if the family doesn't agree, that let's say somebody passes on, they will never, what happens to the business? They don't agree to doing something, then everything lingers. So they really need to come to an agreement and get someone that's experienced in dealing with this.
Exactly. And Joanne, in your experience, or even based on this, why do you think that this is such a hard topic? Like, why do you think people put off these meetings with trust and estate attorneys and don't do their planning?
I deal with this all the time I have an accounting firm, and they always put this off because they don't want to hurt people's feelings. They don't want to, families don't want to talk about this, especially I see this in Hispanics a lot. We're raised not to talk about money, not to discuss it. And then when they leave it to the families to address it after the fact. And then families fight over this. It breaks up families. It breaks up everything, the whole family structure. So it's something hard to talk about money. So it's sad, but it's something we don't talk about it. And then you leave it in lingering, and then it's just gets lost. It's sad, but businesses get lost, families get lost over money.
Yes. I couldn't agree more.
Education. A lot of it is education.
Yeah. I completely agree. Simran is talking about trust being a big issue. And, the trust on the part of the parents to think about the next generation and their ability to take the company to the next level, or then something might have happened. And or maybe what you're getting at, Simran, is that this is a little bit like opening a can of worms, right? Once you sort of go there, right, and once you start talking about money and transitions of wealth, suddenly a lot of other issues come up, right? So what I'm hearing is trust. I do know that fear is a big issue. So not only do people not want to talk about money, but also talking about death is also difficult, right? I mean, it's one thing to celebrate the life of someone when they've actually passed on and people go through grieving. It's another thing to say, I know that I am going to pass away at some point in the future, and I'm going to come face to face with that topic, and I'm going to actively talk about it with my children and my spouse. I mean, that's a very different thing. Like we can celebrate, death, and whether it's the Black community, the Hispanic community, we have traditions around celebrating, but it's very different when you talk about the issues around someone passing away prematurely, or even, again, just in advance. And what also comes up are the issues of how do you talk about fairness and what is equitable. So, for example, in every family, and someone's asking, where do families go? Marcus, thank you so much, to buy or sell business. We'll talk about that in a minute. And there were some topics that came up, Marcus, at our last session, but I will address that. Vanessa, thank you for sharing. You said that, being a Hispanic family, some parents may not be aware, maybe your family didn't know that this was even an option. And this comes back to, again, the education. My own family, came up modestly, both my parents from the South, my father's side, sharecropping, on my mother's side, farming. So again, not a lot of money for education, let alone something about, trust planning. And then Soledad, thank you. Thank you. And how often do we hear older generations say, well, these kids today, they just don't know how to work hard, right? They want everything handed to them. And now I sound like my dad. But often there's this perception of a difference in values, which comes up. So there are lots of reasons that come up. But part of what I feel like is my absolute duty as an advisor and as a person of color in this business is to make and share the awareness of what is out there and what is possible, right, in terms of trust planning, and importantly, what happens when you don't, right? And this is going to take us into the first the presentation. And so thank you, Valentina, for cueing this. And what I'd like to do is go, to the first page right here. And this is really an overview of basic as well as advanced income and estate tax planning, right? And let me just say this before we jump into some of the details here. The thing that happens when there is no planning at all, whether or not a family is wealthy, or even they own just their home, or they just have a few assets, in a bank account. What happens when families make no plans, particularly in the state of California, is the estate of the person who's passed away will go into a probate status. Probate is not a good thing. It's basically what happens when there's been no planning and the courts have to come in and they create a process that's very formal. It's expensive, it's time consuming, and it essentially means that if a family, let's say a mother did not have any estate planning taken care of, or a father, that those children would not get access to those assets quickly. They would eventually, but not without an entire probate process. So the first thing that good estate planning does is that, especially in the creation of a trust, is that it avoids probate. And this is true whether or not someone has $50,000 or $5 million or $50 million. You can avoid probate by creating a trust. And again, I'm speaking of in the state of California, where trusts, revocable trusts, are recognized. The second benefit to doing it, estate planning, is that you, as the person setting up your estate, get to dictate where and how you want your assets disposed of, and to whom, right? So is it to your children, to your niece nephews? Is it to other organizations, institutions? You get to decide that. The third, and one of the most important benefits, is if there are young children in the family, parents are required to come up with the guardians for those children. And so that obviously becomes a very important exercise to name those trusted guardians. And then lastly, by going through the very basic estate planning process, the attorneys who you work with ask you to create and essentially sign for a durable power of healthcare, a durable power of attorney, and a healthcare directive. And all of those things are necessary if you're ever in an incapacitated state and someone has to make medical decisions for you. So really, really important that those very basic estate planning documents are completed. Okay. Any questions about that before I move on? Okay, and if so, just open your mic and give a shout out. Otherwise we'll keep going. Okay, or you can put it into the chat. Okay, so let me just ground this conversation a little bit more in what do the current laws allow. Okay, and for this purpose, we're going to talk about the 2020 column, and that continues into 2021. And here's the part that, you know, will require navigating a few details and specifics, and it gets a tiny bit technical, but I want to make sure everybody understands, and I'll try to make it as simple as I can. If I were to pull out of my wallet, which I don't have one of these, but if I were to pull out a Black American Express card and say, this is for anyone, and it represents the amount of money over the course of their entire estate and their life that they could pass away with. And again, I'm just making this up as an example. That American Express card, right, is loaded with approximately 11.58 million. And what that represents is the threshold of assets that any one person right now, today, could pass away with without owing any estate taxes. Okay, so let me just say it again. You in this country right now, based on laws that were enacted in 2016, can pass away with as much as $11.58 million, and that is per person. So almost 23 million for a married couple, right? So the current estate exemptions are considered very, very generous. Again, they were put in place in 2016, and someone can invest, have a business, have business interests, and have those assets at the end of their life equal 11.58. And upon their passing, the accountants who are settling their estate and filing for their estate return will essentially look and say that, okay, this person had 11.58 million of maybe property, of houses, and they are not required to pay any estate taxes. Okay, equally, right, the current law allows a person to pass away and to give over the course of their lifetime 11.58 million in the form of gifts. Okay, and those numbers are one and the same. So one can pass away with 11.58 million in assets, and at the same time, throughout the course of one's lifetime, one can gift away 11.58 million. And that's what that means, where it says gift and estate tax exemption. I like to think of it as a loaded American Express Black card that upon your passing, you swipe it and there's 11.58 million and you're good to go. Okay. There's also what's called a generation skipping transfer tax exemption, which is also the same number, 11.58 million. What does that mean? It's a big kind of a mouthful. It means that an individual who has children and the expectation to have future descendants can make an election basically saying that if they make a gift and transfer assets from their generation into the next generation, and they decide to use their generation skipping tax exemption, that those assets, whatever they grow to in the future, will never be exposed to estate taxes. So it's a very, very powerful exemption that one can elect. Okay. And then let me also just share that if someone, for example, makes a gift that is in excess of what you can legally gift away, right? So if, let's say, if someone wanted to gift, let's say $20 million, right, into the next generation, they would owe the excess over and above the $11.58 million. And I hope that that makes sense. And the estate or the gift tax rate is very high. If their gift up to 20 million, it's 40%. So most want to avoid those gift taxes by using other elements of the law and strategies. So could I ask Valentina if I could have you roll forward, okay, to this concept of gifting early, okay? And if anybody, I'm going to just monitor the chat to see if there's anything that's coming up, okay? Thank you, Fernando, about living forever. Yes, sometimes we're not ready to pass on businesses, but this is a quick overview of the importance of gifting early and actively moving assets out of one's estate. And again, why are we doing this, right? It's no longer just a question of avoiding probate. It's now a question of making sure that one doesn't pass away with greater than $11.58 million. Okay. Let me also say that right now, while the gift and estate exemption is very, very large, 11.58, that 11.58 is set to expire, and the number after 2026 is expected to be under $5 million. So someone who is a business owner that has a business and they own, let's say, 100% of it by the family, and the business is worth $50 or $100 million, and suddenly the estate exemption is going to fall from 23 million for a married couple down to less than 10. That is what we would consider a ring the alarm, ring the bells opportunity for planning. And there's a member who's not here today. Her name is Terry Hilliard. She's a terrific trust and estate attorney. If she were here, she would say absolutely that warrants a really important conversation around planning, because with the expected estate exemption to fall from 11.58 to under 5 million, an individual with a family business suddenly just has created a very large tax problem for themselves, and thus the importance of working to strategize to mitigate those taxes. Now, why would those exemption levels be changing? Well, if you think about the government, and if they are able to collect taxes from wealthy individuals who pass away and have to pay 40% on the value of their estate exemptions, because the exemption is so large right now, it means that the government is losing out on a lot of revenue that they otherwise would have collected, right? So by changing and ratcheting down the estate exemption, the government is basically saying we are going to claw back all of that forfeited revenue that happened beginning in 2016. And if you watch the allowable gift and estate exemptions, they will change based on the priorities of the current lawmakers and the administration. So for those that have family businesses, this becomes a significant planning opportunity. So on this page, what I'd like to just draw attention to is the importance of the gift and estate tax. So let's just review a couple things here. A generous donor can make transfers over the course of their lifetime and at death. And a donor may individually make small gifts that are considered annual exclusion gifts to any number of recipients in a year. So we've not talked about annual exclusion, but there is the ability for someone to be generous with without having to pay taxes. That's called an annual exclusion gift. The bigger gifts that I've been talking about are in really the second bullet point, right? Where in 2020 and in 21, the federal gift and estate exemption is 11.58 million, and it will revert to 5 million in 2026. And that's what we've been discussing here. The value of the gifts made in excess of that $5 million in 2026 or in excess of 11.58 is subject to that 40%. So again, that's what we're trying to avoid here. There is something called a cost basis, which is the actual original cost of the assets. And when someone passes away, the basis or the actual registered, recorded basis of the tax of the cost of that asset will change to the current fair market value. That's called a step-up basis. So that if a family at that point wanted to sell the asset, the basis has stepped up. So let's say you have a piece of real estate for $3 million purchased, it's now worth $7 million. Rather than sell it and pay capital gains on the difference between 3 and 7, at the death of the owner, it now steps up to the full 7 million as the recorded tax basis. And if the family sold it, 7 minus the 7 cost is 0, so 0 taxes. And that's a very important part of the tax code, that step up. But the real thing that I want to mention here is that a taxpayer whose assets have, and this is the area in blue called gifting early, a taxpayer whose assets have an aggregate value that exceeds that exemption, they should consider using some of available exemption to make gifts. And by doing so, they've eliminated assets from their estate and any future appreciation on those assets. And as a result, they end up with a lower overall estate. Okay, and a taxpayer could enhance the potential benefit of gifting by making a gift into a very specific trust. And in this case, we'll call it the Irrevocable Grantor Trust. And if that trust is structured where the person who sets it up is responsible for paying the taxes, that's called a Grantor Trust. And the benefit there is that the person who sets up the trust, if they are responsible for taking care of the taxes, that means that they're just further depleting assets from their estate, right? And generally, you will see attorneys make that recommendation to a grantor, to a family that wants to set up trust for their children and transfer ownership interests in a company and continue to pay those taxes. Because again, what are we trying to do here? We're trying to reduce the value of the estate for the parents. Okay. Can we just open it up 1 second, Valentina? Because I want to just go back to the family, to the open discussions. We can go off of the book for a second, right? So just back to the case for a second. And you hear that there's this company, their children, there are parents who are hesitant. Is there agreement that with parents who are in their 80s that they should begin doing some estate planning and that they should begin using some of their estate exemption while the exemptions are currently 11.58 million per person? Any thoughts there? Thank you, Fred. Thank you for volunteering, Fred. Love to hear your thoughts. And thank you, Alaya. Yeah, Fred, please.
Yeah, you really are making an excellent presentation. And the various issues that you talk to are really critical and key. And I can tell you, I'm 77 years old. My father and I started a company 60 years ago. It's almost $1 billion company. When we started the company, I thought that at 21 years old, I thought that by the time I was 65 years old, our company would be a $3 million company. Mm-hmm. That was, I thought, a lifetime accomplishment. And here we are, when I was 65, the company was probably close to $500,000 or $500 million in sales. But the real point I want to make is that all the issues that you're talking about, are exactly what I and my father had to go through for all, over the years. And my father passed away about 8 years ago. So now, I've been going through those issues with my children. Mm-hmm. And so the children my children are doing very well. There's always the issue of trust and mm-hmm. Owners, founders. This is a founders issue primarily. Founders are, it's just difficult for them to trust and let go. Mm-hmm. But I think the counter to that is founders also love their children.
Yes.
Very much.
Yes.
But yet they don't trust them. And mm-hmm. so I think that's where, it's time to, maybe you should get a counselor or, mm-hmm. An advisor to sit down and try to, find out, ask your father, even you can do these yourself, sometimes a little bit more difficult, but ask your father, say, Dad, what are the things that you don't trust us about? Mm-hmm. And then he could write them down. And then the family can take those issues and talk about them and say, well, this is what Dad said about trust. And so he's afraid that we won't work as hard. Well, I think you should possibly make a comment to that and say, Dad, we're going to work really hard for this business, but we need you to guide us. And so you have to it's almost like going to school again mm-hmm. with people that you love, and yes. It's very difficult. The other thing that is a struggle for founders is that founders, when they think about passing the company on, they think that well, my children need to start at the very bottom, just like mm-hmm. I did.
Yes, yes.
And that's a mistake that founders make. All founders make that mistake mm-hmm. because they've grown the business from nothing to $100 million in business. In this case, the Leaf Life company. Mm-hmm. And what it takes to run a $100 million company versus running a company that had nothing mm-hmm. are the skills and the qualifications yes. are very, very different. And yes. this is where an education comes in, especially a college education.
Yes.
For the children to think about what their role is and why school is so important is because you need to be more business focused. You need to understand balance sheets. You need to yes. understand marketing. You need to understand all these somewhat basic business skills. And that's what your job, your parents, the founders never had that experience. Yes. They just learned everything by, usually by, we did the same thing. I did the same thing. I always did things wrong first before I did it right. I just tried not to do it wrong the second yes. time. So it's just, so it's a learning, that's my college education. I didn't go to college, but that was my college education. So, there's a lot here. The founders talk about, the employees, well, and how important they are. And without a doubt, a company that doesn't treat its employees with dignity, with respect, with appreciation, with fairness, they will not succeed, because that's the key to growing a business, is having your employees, appreciate what they have, and then helping the company to grow. I don't care where, from the very bottom employees to the very top employees. Very, very, important. But I wanted to get back to this whole issue of, the founders talk about giving the company and how important it is. But there's this issue, what I call stakeholders. And I think that, who are the stakeholders? Let me tell you who the stakeholders are at our company. Stakeholders are my children and my grandchildren, because they have been gifted stock and they own the company. Our vendors. We have vendors, hundreds of vendors, but we have vendors whose companies depend on our company to survive. So every year, we have to, it's our responsibility to give our vendors a plan, what our business plan is to grow the next year. That way they can start planning their business to grow and be ready to produce the products that we need. Because if they don't produce those products, we're not going to be able to grow our business either. So there's the community. The communities are stakeholders. A lot of communities invest in companies, with various tax savings things and whatnot that you can take advantage of. But your employees live in a community, their families depend on these communities to prosper. So businesses have a responsibility to helping their communities. There's the employees who I already mentioned, are so important. They're very, very important stakeholders. And so, the business has a responsibility for them to grow and prosper through their business. So, there's, who else were the stakeholders? I think that's pretty much it. But what the children need to understand is that their role is not necessarily to go in and run the business at the bottom. They need to be thinking at a larger level, and that's really important. And their jobs, and this is where founders get a little confused, because their jobs are be more important. Their jobs are, children's jobs are going to be more important, because they need to be thinking strategically about how to grow the business. When you're talking about $100 million business that it wants to grow 10%, maybe the next year, or 5%. Well, 5% is $5 million. 10% is $10 million. That's 10 million is significant, but for privately held businesses, it's very common for these businesses to grow more rapidly than a Fortune 500 company, or a public company, because the employees that they have are able to support and work harder for a privately held business than they might for a Fortune 500 company. So that's in our company, we call it the secret sauce. Our secret sauce is our they are the ones that are, we're going to grow 10%. The employees are the ones that have to work and grow it and whatnot. So it's really, really important. And I can talk forever on all the different things that we've had to face. But the bottom line is that, families have to learn to sit down and talk to each other. And it's because, Dad, Mom, I love you, but we need to talk about this, and not to hurt your feelings, but because we all want the same thing. We want the business to grow and to prosper, but it's going to be our job. So we need your help to get to that level. So there's so much that you need to do. Family businesses need advisors. Most family businesses have accountants and they have bankers, where they go to the bank and they give them the money and whatnot. Well, I think the bank, the families need to get to know these bankers so they can, and if they need a new lawyer, a good lawyer or whatever, I've done this before. I've gone to my banker and say, can you recommend a good lawyer out there? That can, because I need a good lawyer.
Yes.
And you can go to the accountants and you can ask them the same thing, and when it comes to hiring people, these I call them advisors to your family, but they're, there are bankers, which means that we're their customers.
That's
and
right.
So they always want to help every business wants to help their customers. So,
Fred, let me just jump in and just say,
and I think I'll just stop there because I can go on forever, and I don't want to take away from what because the list that you gave us, that was a very, very important list. We should make a copy of those. Everybody should. And each one of those points that you identified at the very bottom is basically the to-do list. These are the things that we need to do for our business to prosper, for us to do some proper estate planning. I call it tax avoidance.
Sure.
May I offer
the bottom line is founders need to understand if they don't gift their ownership away to their family, the government is going to get half of it, and then there won't be anything left for the rest of the family. So you got to put, what's the reality check? That's what sometimes is missing, is that you don't do this, this is going to happen. Somebody wrote a note, we don't like to pay attorneys. I can understand that. Nobody likes to pay attorneys, but it's all about return on investment. What are they going to do for you? How much money are they going to save you?
That's right.
By these blueprints, these plans, estate planning and whatnot. If you don't get it done,
That's right.
your business is going to die.
That's
and
right.
the family is going to lose everything. So I'll stop there.
Fred, let me just say, and thank you so much for just being such a wealth of information, and what an incredible asset you are to the Institute. And there's so much here. And let me just respond to a couple of things. One, I completely agree that families that are running closely held businesses that have, all of these issues around estate planning, next generation, succession planning, governance, it's really important that the family get the right advisors and learn how to actively communicate around these really important agendas. This is not Thanksgiving conversation. It's not, sitting down over the holidays and having casual conversations or watching, football or soccer, right? These are conversations that have to be structured with agendas, with some oversight, and often an independent person facilitating the conversation, because otherwise it gets a little too personal. And what you need is to stay on track so that all of these issues can be addressed. So I really, really completely applaud everything you've said, including the importance of learning and practicing how to communicate. The other thing you said is making sure that you don't, as a founder, simply expect your children to start exactly where you did, right? And it's sweet, right? And there's, it comes from a good place, which is the transference of values, which is making sure that younger generations know the value of hard work. They know what sweat equity is. And somehow, the thought is that if you just hand kids a business, that somehow they're going to run it into the ground and they won't respect it. Well, I think Fred's point was really, really spot on, which is that this isn't a beginning startup business with a small investment. These are mature businesses that have very different credit profiles, customer, employee, stakeholders in the community, brands, and many of them are getting set up for strategic acquisitions or for to be acquired by private equity firms, and it requires to keep it in the family and to make sure that the family isn't vulnerable. It requires getting all of those kids at that second and third generation into school and into college, and with the right backgrounds and professional education. So I couldn't agree more. And thank you for sharing just that personal story about your own company, your own journey, and what it has meant to gift to your children and grandchildren. And we're all hearing it from you personally that this was something you were able to take advantage of, and clearly you got the right advice. And it ensures, Fred, your and your father's legacy, right? Which is just such a beautiful thing. It chokes me up every time when I think about it, because as we know, a company like Fred's and his father, don't come along every day, and it takes real careful planning and strategy and foresight and careful stewardship to make sure that the cycles continue and that the next generation, picks up the values, but also the insights on how to manage and be well positioned for the future. And this is the last thing I'll say. I'm a investment advisor, and I help clients put financial assets into the market. And I'll tell you that when you look at the near-term expected return on assets in the public markets versus the private markets, right, there is no doubt, right, if you look at the largest institutions and foundations, whether it's Yale or Harvard, my alma mater, or the other significant endowments, and you look at the way they are investing their portfolios, they are over allocating to businesses like Fred's. Right? Why? Because of that growth rate, because of the ability to work hard, to leverage the skill set and talent, just like Fred said, and the outcomes, particularly when you have the right kind of capital structure and when you have the right positioning, those are the opportunities. So thank you again, Fred, for those great insights. I just want to touch on a couple of more slides. Valentina, if I could just ask you to bring back the presentation. And so this is just a quick one more page on the value of gifting early. If anybody would like this, please let Fernando know, and I'd be happy to make this presentation available to you. Actually, Valentina, I'm going to ask you to just dial this back to the table of contents. And I know we didn't plan for this, but I just, in the interest of time, I want to make sure everybody knows. If you scroll back a few pages to page 2 in this presentation. One more back. Sorry. Okay, go forward. Sorry. I just want to get to the table of contents. Keep going. Keep going. One more. Right here. Okay. So this is going to be the quick and dirty trust and estate overview, right? So what have we talked about? We've talked about the fact that there is an American Express level of estate and gift exemption that is available. It's currently very, very large. It's $11.58 million. It's very generous. Came in under the prior administration in 2016. It is expected to sunset in 2026. And there is some concern that the current administration, the Biden administration, is actually going to potentially ratchet back that 11.58 million before 2026, which if they have the votes, they're able to. So what does that mean? For any family business where there is significant value, where the owners have greater than 11.58 million in ownership value per person, right? It means that there is a huge opportunity for planning. And this book here, and all the chapters from 1 to 9 are about gifting early, which is what we started to talk about. There are strategies about how you create a irrevocable life insurance trust and use insurance as an asset to help fund estate taxes, right? So for large estates with closely held businesses where even if they do gift, they are still likely to be a very large estate tax bill upon the passing of the parents, an irrevocable life insurance trust. That's in chapter 2. That's a structure that is part of the advanced planning discussion. There is also what's called a credit shelter or a bypass trust structure that is in here. And this is where both a married couple can ensure that they are using the available exemptions and not paying any estate taxes until the second person to die in the family. Right, that's chapter 3. I'm going to skip over chapter 4, and I want to talk about probably the most important strategy, which is the sale or the loan to a irrevocable grantor trust. And this is effectively where a family can say, look, we have all these family members. We have this huge monster business that we want to make sure stays in the family. We also don't want to owe a lot to the government if one of us should pass away soon or even later in life. The sale and loan structure to a irrevocable, what's called a defective grantor trust. It's a little garbly, but it's called an IDGIT, right? Think of it as a sale and a loan structure to a trust. This becomes one of the most powerful ways to move assets or ownership interests. So when Fred was talking about gifting to children and grandchildren, I would hazard a guess, Fred, that you had this topic come up in your discussions. And this is a very well accepted, well regarded way to move assets out of one estate and move them to the next generation. So it becomes that IDGIT. So trust sometimes can suggest a bad word, right? As though you're going to mess up the lives of children and grandchildren and make them silver spoon, trust fund kids. And I want to be really clear for anyone who thinks that trusts are a bad thing. The devil is in the details of how trusts are set up and the parameters with which a parent moves assets into the next generation, and the structures and restrictions that are placed on the trust itself for the purpose of distribution. So, for example, we have clients who say, I want to take advantage of the generosity and the tax law, and I don't want to give any excess money to the government, so I want to gift, but I only want these funds to be used for education, right? For my children, their children, and future descendants. And I would love for whatever the growth of these assets is, I never want them to be exposed to estate taxes. That can be done. It doesn't mean that children are going to start buying exotic cars, going to Vegas, becoming or exhibiting spendthrift, which is a real thing that is in trust to make sure that assets are safely taken care of. There's also the role of trustees that are both family or friends who are acting in a professional capacity or a professional institution to act as a professional licensed trustee or corporate trustee that has that oversight. And if anyone would like to know a little bit more about any of these topics, please let me know. The other in chapter 6 is a very specific type of trust. It's different than the trust or the sale or the loan, but this is called a qualified personal residence trust. And this is essentially where you remove real estate out of an estate. So let's say there is a treasured family home that the family vacationed at that they want to keep in the family and they want the future generations to enjoy for many, many years to come. There is a way for the owners, let's say they're back to our founders, they're in their 80s, and they say, we don't need to have this $3 or $4 million home in our estate when we might pass away in 10 years or so. We want to make sure that this stays in the family. The Qualified Personal Residence Trust, or QPERT, is the way that this can be structured, where again the asset comes out of the estate and it gets transferred for the benefit of the future generations. And then the last 3 chapters are really about how to make use of charitable structures so that local community and local stakeholders who helped to support the company can benefit from the family's generosity, and at the same time, it becomes part of what we call prudent tax planning, because when a family makes a gift to either a charitable lead trust or a charitable remainder trust, that family gets a tax deduction, and their family members also participate in distributions that come out of the trust. So for many clients, they like it because it accomplishes really a few things. One, the charitable deduction. Two, the family gets a distribution. And three, the charities get a distribution and benefit over a period of time for the term of the trust as well. So again, we're not going to spend too much detail in going through every structure because there's a lot here. And obviously it makes sense to make sure you get the right tax advice, bringing in an attorney that will do the drafting. Right. So to Fred's point about making sure you have the right members of the team, the chapters 2 through 6, those are considered more advanced topics, and they again require an attorney who's fluent with dealing with closely held businesses, dealing with these more advanced trust structures, and advising clients who have more complex assets such as closely held businesses. So with that, why don't I have Valentina open up the room again and take down the PowerPoint. And any reactions, any thoughts, any questions? Fred, any comments on some of that last part there?
I think the timing is really, really important in this process. And I actually started my gifting when I was in my 50s. And my rationale for doing that was just give it to my kids, or give it to the government. That's, have them a chance to take what my father and I started and create a better future for themselves. So, this is not rocket science. That's what people need to understand. It's all doable, but you got to take the time. You got to think about it and come up with processes. I mean, even have a Sunday dinner where the family gets together. And yes, you're going to eat a nice dinner, but you could also take the time to start talking about a couple of things.
Yes. Yes. There is this expression, and if Fernando, maybe you've talked about this with your student, it's called the shirt sleeves to shirt sleeves paradigm, right? And it's this idea that you have hardworking grandparents start a business, and maybe they had, modest lifestyle, couldn't afford very much. And so they didn't have fancy long sleeve shirts or, cufflinks or ties or anything. And they just, salt of the earth, kind of working a lot of elbow grease to kind of, to work hard and create something. And then that second generation grew up wealthier and had more luxury, and had the ability to spend and worked hard, and worked in the business, right? And then the third generation became largely simply, the beneficiaries of just trust distributions, right? Without actually working in the business. And the idea is that without the proper governance and conversations, whether it's the Sunday dinners, the facilitated mediated conversations, the family retreats by professional advisors, that fourth generation is back to the shirt sleeves, right? And it's probably a little overstated in terms of a framework, but the idea is that you started more modestly and ended up in the same relative modest position because of mistakes that might have been made, right? And more than anything, the prudent planning and the strategies, right, that we've talked about here are largely designed, to Fred's point, so that the government does not become the largest beneficiary of all of that hard work. So
if I may add to that and piggyback on what Fred said as well, I don't believe this is tax avoidance. I think at the end of the day, you are trying to preserve a lifetime of savings. These are the assets and the savings that you did not simply spend on fancy cars, but you were planning to save for your legacy and your family and for the continuous operations of your next generation. So you have to do everything in your power to be able to plan strategically to keep those generations with an additional opportunity and by preserving those savings and passing them along in a wise way. So thank you once again for all the comments, everybody.
Absolutely. Please, Fred. Yes.
Yeah, I just one comment for the group that I want to make, and that is that, how do you get started? That's the hard part. How do you get started? And what I did is I sat down with my mother and my father, and I told them, Dad, Mom, this is, if we need to do estate plan so we can transfer the wealth or whatever, I can manage that process. But what I will do for you is I will guarantee that you will have, a lifetime income for the rest of your life.
Mm-hmm.
And that money will be not for you to get richer, so to speak, but to maintain a lifestyle that will provide you with all the things that you want to do. Go visit your grandchildren, do this, do that, which my mother did. And that was the, having that, when I made that commitment to my parents, that's when they were able to just, okay, if you do that for me. And also there was an annual increase, we have inflation out there and whatnot. So there was an inflationary increase every year. It wasn't rocket science. That worked for us.
Yeah.
It really did. And it got us going. And the rest took a lot of time. So, okay.
Well, what I love about what you said, Fred, is that you got right to the pain point, right? And what it sounds like your parents needed to understand and have confidence around is that if they did this next generation planning with you at the center, right, that they could be sure and clear that they were going to be income beneficiaries of some part of this strategy, and that they would not have to worry, right? And that's Valentina and I were chatting earlier with Fernando about the intersection of psychology, right, and business, and I know that Fred will completely agree that being a good psychologist and being able to read and understand people and address fears and have hard conversations and sit in the discomfort is part of how families get to these breakthrough moments where they can find common ground and arrive at good, prudent planning, right? So anyway, well, I think this is probably a good place to stop. Sorry, question? Yeah?
Yes, this is Bernice. And I am so glad that we're having this conversation because my husband and I, we've been talking about it a lot. And it's coming from a place of blended families as companies, as you're building a business and you have a blended family of kids who, are on roller coasters. They get along one day, don't get along the next. And trying to make sure that the business does continue and continue in a way that you want it to go without the disruption of the kids going berserk when, God forbid that day happens when we're passing on. So I'm glad that we're having this, I'm listening to you and having this conversation because we're trying to figure out which is the best direction. I heard you mention vacation homes. Are personal homes also a part of that trust?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes, the Cupert Qualified Personal Residence Trust, those can be used for personal residences as well as vacation, right? Absolutely. And let me just say, Dr. Bernice, first of all, thank you for the question. There is this desire. I'm a mother. I have 2 children. I know what it means to want to give the best to care. And, when you take siblings, there's usually always something to squabble and fuss about. always, right? You breathed my air, right? Or you gave them, more jelly beans than you did me when we were 6 and 7, right? So there's always something. But the wonderful thing about trust and estate planning is there is room to have and express, one, your values, two, talk about your aspirations for fairness and equity, right, inside a family. And at the end of the day, right, we're all dust to dust, right? And we get caught up in between with, money and things. And a lot of times it's the emotional element of something that at the end of the day really doesn't matter. This was great grandmother's and, I absolutely have to have this one and only one, right? We know is silly, right? Silly, right? Including some really breakthrough moments where siblings came together through a rotational pulling a name out of a hat, basically, and drawing straws for how they would go around and decide on the personal effects from mom and dad and what they wanted, right? So rather than burden the parents with making individual decisions of all of every little thing, right? Leave it to the next generation, leave it to adult kids to decide with a process, right? So here's the governance, right? Where they can choose and have some fairness, including rotating who gets to pick, right? So there are lots of different ways. The other is people fuss and fight around the memorabilia and the image of something, whether or not it has a lot of value. And one of the things that I recommended to one of the attorneys I work with is that they allocate a budget in the estate planning process for capturing all of the memorabilia by photograph, and including bringing in a professional photographer to capture all the photos, right? All the digital archives, right? Because digital archives in a family should be available to everyone. There's not a reason to sort of decide, well, so-and-so is going to get the pictures and so-and-so is going to get this and this, right? So, and the attorney thought, that's a great idea. I'm going to use that, for my future clients. And again, these were digital archives that happen to just mean a lot to the family. So the good news is that I think there are mechanisms where families can work through what fairness looks like, where there is some, way to meet. The other thing is trusts have language that is pretty typical that says that if any sibling brings a lawsuit, right, against the estate, right, they are automatically disinherited, right? And that, and sometimes you can't control behavior, but that becomes a really important part of the drafting that most attorneys will include. So anyway, hopefully that's helpful. Fernando, back to you to just close this up. And thank you again. Thanks to everybody for being here on a Friday. Fred, thank you for such prudent, wise, sage advice. We are all very grateful.
Thank you all once again. And I will go ahead and submit these slides along with the edited videos next week for sessions 1, 2, and 3 that have been edited. It's always a pleasure to host you, and please let us know we can be of any further assistance in your success trajectory, right? We aim to bring advisors. Gail, thank you so much for sharing your expertise with our members and the public. This is critically important in making sure that we protect the legacy of our family businesses in our community. We will be promoting more events in the future, and thank you once again. Gail, it's been a pleasure.
Thank you so much, Fernando.
And I know it's happy hour now for most of you, so please enjoy.
Enjoy the afternoon. Thank you.
Okay, thank you.
Hello, Dr. Parra. I seem to have lost my video feed because my computer died halfway through. But if you want to, you have any time, just anytime this weekend, just give me a call. And then if you want to get together or something.
Yes, let me know if you're available in about 5 minutes. Are you available?
Yep, no problem.
Thank you. Thank you. Yeah, I just want to thank you so much for once again for being with us today. I think everybody got a lot from these conversations, and I hope that we can follow up with some deeper advising if with some soon as members get their content.
Gail, you're muted.
Sorry, I was just going to say thank you, Fernando.